a single candle, and a whisper that refused to die. Welcome to Detective Noir. I am your host, Daniel Mercer. This mystery-loving community is incredible. Comment where you're listening from. Your voices make it all worthwhile. Let's begin. It was one of those evenings when the rain could not decide whether to pelt or merely brood, and so elected to do both by turns. The lamps in Baker Street swam like yellow coins dropped in a black river, and a persistent draught sang faintly in the chimney, as if to tune itself to the melancholy mood of my friend. Holmes had not stirred from the Persian slipper since the forenoon, and save for an occasional long arm stretched to reclaim his pipe from the mantel, he might have been a figure carved in grey wood. I had just returned from a late call in Wimpole Street and was warming, my hands at the fire when I heard the soft but urgent step upon the stair which denotes a visitor, who wishes his business known at once, yet fears the consequences of declaring it. Mrs. Hudson presented our caller with an air half indulgent and half apprehensive. He was a slight gentleman in a rain-darkened travelling cloak, whose face, though composed, exhibited that pallor which comes of sleeplessness and the prolonged repression of anxiety. His eyes, large and thoughtful, flicked once from my friend's recumbent figure to the fender and back again, as if to take his courage from the glowing coals. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he in a voice whose careful quietude did not conceal a tremor. "I am Lionel Ashcroft, private secretary to Lady Eugenia Vale of Ashwick House near Dulverton. I beg you, sir, if your time is your own, come to us. There has been an occurrence in the night, which Scotland Yard cannot fit to their experience, and which our local men have resolved into an explanation that will not bear the slightest pressure of reason." Holmes's eyelids, which had drooped with that feline indifference which is only the coverlet to his keenest attention, lifted a fraction. "You bring more than a wet coat, Mr. Ashcroft," he murmured. "Cardamom upon your cuffs is not the habit of a travelling man, unless he has been forced to steady his stomach. Your left sleeve bears an irregular smear of pale wax at the seam, foreign to London candles, for our tallow is of a darker cut, and your voice is hoarse as if you have spent hours whispering, or else in rooms where one instinctively lowers the voice. The house of mourning, I think. Sit nearer to the fire and tell me what whispered to you in the dark." It is always the same when Holmes speaks in that manner. The relief on a client's features is profound and immediate, though what comfort is to be taken from such uncanny perception I cannot say. Ashcroft sank upon the edge of the settee and held out his hands to the blaze. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes," said he, "that Lord Adrian Vale, who was her ladyship's husband, departed this life 3 nights ago, after a short and painful fever. He made his will last Michaelmas, so there were no doubts to trouble us on that score. Lady Eugenia had kept watch in the oak parlour, where the body lay in state according to the old country custom. The shutters were closed, the mirrors veiled, and the servants had strict orders to let none pass save myself and Dr. Newbury, the village man. There is a candlestick on either side of the bier, a pair of tall old silver pieces with a fluted stem, family heirlooms. About 2 hours after midnight yesterday, this would be the early morning of the 9th, her ladyship rang for me. She was pale but entirely in command of herself. "Mr. Ashcroft," said she, "there is a whisper that follows the candlelight." Holmes's eyes left the ceiling and fixed themselves upon the man's face. "Go on," said he. I entered the parlour with her. "It is a long room, Mr. Holmes, all oak panelling and a high-carved mantel with the family devices in relief. The air had that peculiar chill which clings to ancient wood. There were only the 2 candles lit. Lady Eugenia took up the one at the left and bade me observe. She moved very slowly along the room. I heard it too, sir, Dr. Watson. Both of you must believe me. A whispering, very faint, like a draught sighing through a reed. It was not constant. It seemed to follow the flame. When her ladyship paused, it ceased. When she advanced, it resumed. When she raised the candle, the whisper grew thin, and when she lowered it nearer to the wainscot, it deepened to something like a word, though no word I could recognize. We tested the windows. They were barred and shuttered. We examined the door, locked within. Twice I traversed the room in the opposite direction, and twice the sound kept pace with the light. Her ladyship is not a credulous woman, Mr. Holmes, but I confess that had I been alone I should have fled that place." Holmes had half risen. His face had altered, as it does when some new note reaches that singular mind of his. The features sharpen, the eyes brighten, and he seems to draw up from an internal spring a reserve of energy, as cool and limpid as a well. "You were not alone," he said. "Yet something profited by your occupation," Ashcroft swallowed. "When we returned to the beer, I noticed a small crispness, the merest scallop of singe, upon the edge of the black pall near the foot, as though a flame had kissed it. Her ladyship chided me for carelessness with the candle. I would have sworn I had kept it far from the cloth. We left the parlour before dawn. At 9, when I came down with Dr. Newbury to make arrangements for the undertaker, the parlour door, still locked when I left it, stood ajar. Within, the right-hand candlestick had toppled, the wax having run in a thick lake upon the floor, and the flame had guttered out. There was a smell of vinegar quite distinct in the air. The safe in the adjoining study was open, and the testament, the late Lord's will, had been removed and half burned upon the hearth. A portion remains charred at the edges. Scotland Yard holds that the heir, Mr. Roland Vale, Lord Adrian's nephew, must have done it, but he was in Exeter till noon, and arrived only after the commotion began. They say then it was I, or else that grief has disordered her ladyship's senses, and I abet her fancies. "And Dr. Newbury?" asked Holmes. "An honest fellow of the old school," replied our visitor. "He pronounces upon death and dosages from long habit, but he is no hand at locks or whispering candles. He believes I inadvertently left the door upon the latch, and that a common thief, or uncommon given such impudence, took advantage. But why a thief should take only the will and burn it? Why, too, he should leave behind a smear of some sticky substance upon the lower sash of the far window. Dr. Newbury does not say." Holmes's fingers, steepled at his lips, opened and closed like a conjurer's fan. "A sticky substance," he repeated. "Colour, pale, no, almost clear. It had the faintest scent. No, again, not a scent so much as a suggestion. Like beeswax laid too thin. The very faintest. I noticed it because a moth had caught its wing there and was half glued, poor creature, to the wood. Also, this may be nothing. One of the mantel clock's little brass fittings is gone, the clapper, I think you call it, for the bell that strikes the quarter. Your mistress, Lady Eugenia, upon whom does the late will dispose? We cannot know precisely until the remainder is deciphered," said Ashcroft, and here his voice shook for the first time. But Lord Adrian had long intended a substantial settlement upon Lady Eugenia, and a smaller, though honourable portion upon his nephew. His lordship had quarrelled lately with Mr. Roland about certain mining shares, yet there was affection between them. The old will, made 12 years ago, leaves the greater part to the nephew and certain properties in trust. If that is now the instrument which will stand, he could not finish. The rain drummed its dry fingers upon the window, though there was not light enough outside to distinguish the fingers from the pane. Holmes rose abruptly, crossed to Ashcroft, and in a movement so swift that our visitor started back, lifted the man's left elbow to the lamplight. "Your seam, Mr. Ashcroft. Yes, there is the wax, as I noted. But notice also this faint grey upon your cuff, ash of a very fine character, and here at the hem grains of something like pumice. Yet you came to us straight from Paddington, did you not?" "I did." "Then these attachments are not of the railway. They are of a parlour that has been lately scoured, or a hearth that has been lately swept in haste. And the vinegar. Who thought to cast vinegar into the air?" Ashcroft blinked. "I cannot say, Mr. Holmes. The housemaid, perhaps. She is young and came to the door this morning with red eyes. To mask another odour, perhaps," Holmes remarked to the fire, "or to fix a residue. Each household has its chemistry, Watson. I have seen murder veiled with lavender, and theft hidden under the honest stink of onions." He moved then with decision, flinging the remains of his pipe into the grate and kicking the slipper under the chair. "You have brought the fragment of the will." Ashcroft drew a sealed envelope from within his coat and placed it in Holmes's hand. "My mistress bade me keep it until I found the one man in England," she said, "who would hear a whisper and tell her what it had said." Holmes weighed the packet with the odd, dry amusement that never reaches his mouth. Lady Eugenia is as accurate in her choice of phrases as she is in her estimate of persons. "Watson, you will oblige me by packing the little lens, the measuring rod, and the folding rule. Mr. Ashcroft, has anyone examined the panelling?" "No, then we shall." A whisper that follows a light must either be a voice that disdains ordinary lungs, or a thing that prefers a draught to an audience. "We shall see whether your oak parlour contains both. But you will come?" Ashcroft's relief escaped him at last. Holmes was already at the door. "There is a train at 8 past to Taunton with a branch for Dulverton, if memory serves. Between now and then, I shall take the liberty of observing your right hand. You keep your nails remarkably clean for a secretary who has, by his own account, been sorting hearth ash and rescuing moths. Yet the index nail is nicked at the side. Twine can do that. And there is a dark trace beneath the thumb from some metal polish. You have been polishing something small and brass, perhaps searching for a missing clapper. No, then someone else was. We will ask your housemaid why her eyes were red and whether she keeps vinegar in the parlour." He threw me my coat with that air half command and half camaraderie which I had long since ceased to resent. As I donned it, Ashcroft rose, clutching his travel cloak to him as a man in a storm keeps tight hold of his last dry parcel. "There is one more thing, Mr. Holmes," he said at the threshold. "I do not know if it bears, but it lies upon my mind like a hand. When her ladyship and I made our last circuit with the candle, the whisper seemed for a moment to form a shape. No word, but a shape in the air, as if it would say R, and then swallow the rest. It is foolish, I am sure." Holmes's eyes lit with a curious pleasure, as a chess player's may at the sight of an unexpected gambit. "On the contrary, Mr. Ashcroft," said he, "it is the most sensible thing you have told me. Come, we have just time to catch the train, and I am tempted to learn whether oak can speak when coaxed by flame. If it can, it has chosen a most inconvenient language and a most convenient hour." The rain had not ceased when we reached Paddington, and the lamps threw their soft halos upon the slick flags with that consolatory air peculiar to London in wet weather, as if the city would apologize for the inconvenience by appearing the more romantic. Holmes was in one of his lucid tempers. He spoke little, yet his silence had that tensile quality which assured me that each unregarded trifle of our new case had already found its provisional pigeonhole. Mr. Lionel Ashcroft, after 2 attempts at conversation which Holmes deflected with a courteous monosyllable, resigned himself to the rhythm of the train and folded his hands as a man does when he is determined not to fidget. We made the branch at Taunton, with a bare minute to spare, and were soon rolling westward under skies that clung low upon the hedgerows. Holmes at last leaned forward and tapped our companion's travelling cloak with a finger. "You spoke of vinegar, Mr. Ashcroft. Vinegar is a homely ally. It will fix a dye, scour a stain, and blunt an odour." "One asks always, what odour?" "Of smoke, perhaps," said Ashcroft. The candlestick had fallen, and no. "Smoke proclaims itself without modesty," said Holmes. "When men wish to disguise smoke, they open windows, not bottles. Vinegar suggests fish glue, stale spirits, or phosphorus, domestic trifles, criminal conveniences. And a whisper that dances with a flame. Watson, do you recall the reeds at Layer Marsh where a child's whistle can be made with a slit and a draught?" I did indeed. The memory of our case there, an affair more sordid than tragic, rose up with the picture of a boy, blowing across a green stem to summon a sound like a sleepy adder. "Then keep your childhood close to your ears this evening," Holmes murmured. "Houses whisper for the same reasons reeds do, because men contrive them to, or because a wind finds a throat." The carriage emptied by degrees, until at last we 3 were the only passengers to descend at a damp little station, whose solitary porter looked as if he had grown there like a lichen. A brougham was waiting. Ashcroft handed us in with a gratitude it would have been churlish to decline, and we went at a brisk trot through lanes whose tall banks exhaled that clean, heavy scent which the West Country keeps in store for its nights of rain. Presently the hedges fell away, and Ashwick House loomed long and square, its windows hooded, its stone darkened, and the wisp of a light steady in one frame like a small, brave thought. Lady Eugenia received us in a morning room, whose calm order threw into bolder relief the agitation in her eyes. She was of that English type, firm mouth, candid brow, which wins authority without bidding for it. Her hand in mine was cool and steady. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I am ashamed to ask for reason to stand where affection should suffice, but reason deserted us with my husband." "Affection is rarely strengthened by superstition," he returned. "Show me your oak parlour, Lady Eugenia, and you will forgive me if I use my eyes like an impertinent guest." She led us herself along a passage that smelt of beeswax and old books. The parlour door had been repaired. The new latch shone rawly against the ancient timber. Within, the room answered precisely to Ashcroft's description. Panelled walls the colour of old tea, a great mantle with its carved beasts worn smooth by centuries of dusting, and at the centre the bier under its black pall, now stripped of its office and serving only as a table for wreaths. The air had that lifeless chill one feels in a church at noon. 2 tall silver candlesticks stood in their places, replaced, I imagined, since last night's mishap. The rug near the right-hand stand still bore a stain where wax had pooled and been scraped up again by no very expert hand. Holmes's survey began with the floor. He went upon his knees with the nonchalance of a man indifferent to appearances and ran his lens along the boards, pausing where the pall had been singed. He smelt the place, yes, positively smelt it, then sniffed again near the wainscot, his face brightening and darkening as quickly as a landscape takes cloud and sun. "You have industrious servants, Lady Eugenia," said he at last. "Too industrious. When a thing is scoured, it is because someone wishes to efface a history. Vinegar, yes. And here, Watson, the light. There is the faintest smear on the lower sash inner side at the very meeting rail. It dries glassier than beeswax, and flakes to a brittle thread. Fish glue, I should say, but mixed. Mr. Ashcroft, you will oblige me by bringing the candlestick from the left. No, keep it upright. And set it here. Precisely here." We watched him trace a square upon the floor with his folding rule. He placed the candlestick not where it had stood, but 2 inches forward, and moved his hand slowly until the flame sat directly beneath a narrow seam in the panelling, no more than a hairline to my eye. He lifted the candle half an inch. A murmur, so soft that I should have doubted it had not my ear been at attention, stirred along the oak. He lowered the light. The murmur deepened until it was indeed something like the beginning of a consonant, a rasp of air hinting at speech. Lady Eugenia started, then mastered herself. "You hear it, then," she said. Holmes's mouth twitched. "I hear wood taking a breath where it should not. There is a cavity behind this panel. There is also, I think, a slit communicating with a flue or shaft. Warm air, excited by the candle, passes and makes a voice of the slit. Crude but effective. Now the question, was the cavity born with the house or cut yesterday?" He tapped delicately with the butt of his lens, counting under his breath, then crossed to the mantel clock. He opened its little door and showed us the place where the bell's clapper should have hung. "Your thief is a tidy artisan," said he. "He removes a clapper to silence a quarter stroke. Timing may betray him. He leaves a smear of glue to command a thread. He fixes a door with a latch that will yield to a hair's weight when wax has risen around a base filed to a false plane. The candlestick falls. The room smells of vinegar. The house wakes to confusion, and a visit to the adjoining study need not last 5 minutes. Ashcroft's face had a hunger in it. "A thread?" he echoed. Holmes's long fingers hovered along the moulding at shoulder height, then with a little sound of contentment, pinched something invisible from the angle of a carved leaf. He walked to the window and held his catch to the pane. There it was, a line no thicker than a spider's silk, yet unmistakably artificial. It shone with the faintest glassy gleam, glue-polished, and ended in a fragment of dark fibre that might have been horsehair. "A thread, yes," Holmes said. "The flame is a credulous beast. Give it a partner and it will follow. The whisper persuades the mind, while the thread persuades the eye. And men who work by night prefer to persuade rather than fight." Lady Eugenia's composure broke then not into tears, but into that long breath one has after running. "You will find him," she said in a low voice. "You will tell me whether grief is to be joined by insult. I shall tell you what the oak tells me when asked in the proper language." Holmes returned. "For that I must have the room as it was, in darkness with only 1 candle, and with no one entering by zeal or by curiosity. Mr. Ashcroft, you will station a trusted servant at the corridor end. Let the house suppose we have gone to our beds. Watson, we shall make a little map of this whisper. Bring the rule, the chalk, and the string." The undertaker's floral tributes were removed, save for 1 wreath which Holmes insisted remain at the bier's foot. He tied our string across the room from cornice to cornice, then another from door to window, until there hung a gauze of lines like the web of some rational spider. Upon the floor he marked small crosses at intervals, and wrote numerals so tiny they looked like fly specks. He snuffed the right-hand candle, and commanded the other to be kept burning, wick trimmed to a hair. "We shall wait until the house sleeps," he said. "If our artisan requires a second harvest, he will come. If not, the room itself will confess under experiment. Either way, we shall have a voice more articulate than R before the clock would strike its quarter, if it had a clapper. And, dear lady, lock your study safe tonight. An empty nest is sometimes visited twice by the same prudent magpie. The household had retired under the impression that Holmes and I had gone to our allotted chambers. In truth, we remained within the oak parlour, our coats about our shoulders and the single candle guttering faintly in its silver stand. Holmes had settled himself in the armchair nearest the door, his long fingers drumming lightly upon the arms, his eyes half closed, yet never, I knew, inattentive. The string lattice he had contrived hung across the room, its pale lines just visible in the candle's trembling glow. The faint whisper had already been coaxed twice from the panel during our experiments, and though it set my nerves on edge, I marvelled at the simplicity of the contrivance. Holmes, however, was far from satisfied. The minutes passed in the sort of silence that amplifies the smallest sound, the settling of a beam, the tick of Holmes's watch, the distant murmur of a servant retiring up the back stair. Presently, as the hour neared midnight, I caught from the corridor the muted scrape of a foot upon stone. Holmes's hand flicked up in warning and then sank again, motionless. The latch turned with exquisite slowness, and the door, though we had bolted it, yielded inward by half an inch. I heard the faintest click as the bolt met resistance, then silence. Whoever stood without was testing the latch, hoping, perhaps, that the earlier accident of the candlestick might repeat itself. Holmes rose without a sound, crossed the floor in 2 strides and threw the door wide. A sharp cry escaped the figure beyond. A maid in a plain gown, her apron balled in her fist. She shrank back from the sudden blaze of Holmes's gaze, though his voice, when it came, was mild. "My dear child," he said, "if you wished to listen, you had only to ask. Why is it vinegar tonight and not lavender?" The girl's lips trembled, but no words emerged. Lady Eugenia, roused by the commotion, came quickly from the stair and demanded to know what was amiss. The maid dropped to her knees, sobbing, and confessed in broken sentences that she had been bid to watch the parlour by Mr. Roland Vale, the heir, who had promised her a reward if she reported any movement or discovery. She had indeed sprinkled vinegar upon the floorboards the previous morning, at his suggestion, though she swore she knew nothing of safes or wills. Holmes listened with that imperturbable calm which renders guilt or innocence equally transparent to him. He dismissed the maid gently to Lady Eugenia's care, and closed the door once more. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "the fox is sniffing about the hen-house. But the clever fox too often leaves his brush in the door. This business with vinegar betrays an anxious intelligence. One who fears chemical traces might be discovered by keener noses than his own. We may now be certain Roland Vale has played some part, though whether as architect or pawn remains to be seen. We resumed our vigil. The candle sputtered low, casting grotesque shapes of the string lattice upon the walls. Then, with a suddenness that made me start, the whisper sounded again, louder than before, drawn deep as though the wood itself had learned speech. Holmes's eyes lit. He moved the flame delicately along his grid, and with each shift the sound altered, deepening, thinning, swelling like a breath imprisoned in timber. He halted at a particular junction of strings, pressed his palm against the panel and gave a short, satisfied nod. "Here," he said softly. "There is a hollow not of age but of artifice. The slit behind is cunningly cut, to meet a flue that runs upward, likely the old chimney back of the chamber above. Warm air passing through will answer the flame's motion with this phantom whisper. Ingenious yet childish. Whoever contrived it counted upon imagination doing the rest." He drew from his pocket a thin blade and inserted it along the seam. With a slight pressure, the panel yielded. A recess was revealed, no larger than a gentleman's valise, but sufficient to hold a small lantern and a coil of wire. Within lay also a sheaf of documents bound with twine. Holmes drew them forth, and I recognized at once the scorched edges of the testament Ashcroft had described. The flame was not clumsily dropped, Holmes observed. It was guided, so that confusion should reign while the true object was seized. "And here, Watson, is the clapper removed from the mantel clock, wrapped neatly in cloth. Our whisperer is nothing if not orderly. He examined the documents by candlelight, his brows knitting. Much of the writing was destroyed, yet enough remained to indicate that Lord Adrian had indeed altered his dispositions in Lady Eugenia's favour." Holmes replaced the sheaf carefully and restored the panel, leaving no trace of disturbance. "We must allow the fox a second run," he whispered. In his eagerness, he will show more of his brush than he intends. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall meet Mr. Roland Vale, and I propose we greet him not as accusers, but as spectators. The guilty, when they believe themselves clever, are fond of performance. And I am curious to hear how our young gentleman explains a whisper that follows a candle's light." The candle was extinguished, the room restored, and together we stepped back into the corridor where the air felt freer, though still laden with the weight of unseen motives. Holmes paused at the stair, drawing his coat close about him. "There is a logic to whispers, Watson," he said in a low tone. "They are but words robbed of strength, depending upon the hearer's imagination for their terror. By this time tomorrow, we shall know whether our whisper is the prelude to a crime of calculation, or merely the echo of a foolish contrivance. Either way, someone has thought it worth the price of forgery and fire. That alone makes it worthy of pursuit." And with that he turned toward our chambers, leaving me to ponder the strange ingenuity of a crime that could make oak speak like a phantom and a flame whisper of murder. Morning came grey and damp, with a mist clinging low over the lawns of Ashwick House and curling against the hedges like a retreating tide. Holmes, who had slept hardly at all, seemed no worse for the vigil. I found him in the breakfast room taking a cup of coffee, his fingers drumming a brisk tattoo upon the table. Lady Eugenia entered soon after, composed but pale, and gave us news that Mr. Roland Vale had arrived by early conveyance from Exeter and was even now with her in the drawing-room. Her eyes, however steady, betrayed a trace of apprehension. Holmes rose at once. "It is always instructive, lady," he said, "to meet one's suspect before he knows he is suspected. Lead us in, if you will, and permit me to observe while you conduct the discourse." Roland Vale proved to be a man of 30, handsome in a sharp, restless way, with a quick eye and lips that smiled more often than sincerity demanded. He greeted us with a courtesy tinged by curiosity, his glance resting an instant too long on Holmes's tall frame, and then flicking away as though measuring the use of civility. "So these are the gentlemen summoned to chase away a whisper," he said lightly, though the jest sounded somewhat forced. "Aunt, I cannot conceive why you should distress yourself with phantoms when the more practical matters, probate, a trustee's settlements, cry out for your attention." Lady Eugenia replied with calm dignity that there were questions surrounding Lord Adrian's will which demanded clarity, not haste. At this, Roland's smile faltered, and Holmes, standing by the hearth with his head slightly inclined, took in every nuance as a hound takes the wind. "It is natural, Mr. Vale," Holmes observed gently, "that grief should quicken imagination. Yet sometimes imagination proves the servant of fact. We inspected the oak parlor last night, a curious room. It has the faculty of speech when tempted by a candle." Roland's hand, which had been idly tapping the arm of his chair, ceased abruptly. "I beg your pardon?" he said, a whisper. Holmes continued, as faint as a reed stirred by air. "Ingenious, really, and achieved by no supernatural agency. A contrivance behind the paneling, a cavity meeting a flue and a slit cut to act as a voice. That, combined with a little thread and glue, was enough to persuade the mind that death itself protested." Roland laughed, but it rang brittle. "You astonish me, Mr. Holmes. Some country prank, no doubt, left by an ancestor with a taste for the macabre, or by someone more recent," Holmes said softly. "Someone who required confusion in order to commit an act of mischief. It is remarkable how a whisper can draw attention to itself, while elsewhere a hand removes a will from a safe." For an instant, colour rose to Roland's cheek. Then he leaned back with forced ease. "Surely, sir, you cannot mean to suggest—" "I suggest nothing," Holmes interrupted. "I merely observe. What interests me is the choice of vinegar. Why should a servant, at another's request, sprinkle vinegar on the boards, if not to disguise some trace that might betray tampering?" Roland turned sharply to his aunt. "You have allowed the servants to gossip and meddle, Aunt Eugenia." "It is beneath your dignity." Lady Eugenia did not flinch. "It is beneath our name, Roland, that the testament of my husband should be half burnt upon the hearth. Burnt upon the hearth. The silence that followed was broken only by the clock's tick, restored to service by Holmes with its clapper replaced. Roland's fingers flexed upon the chair arm. Holmes allowed the pause to lengthen, then with sudden briskness crossed the room and drew from his pocket a small scrap of fibre. He held it out delicately. "A thread, Mr. Vale, drawn from the panelling." horsehair polished with glue. It served its purpose to guide the candle's fall. Curious is it not that we found it when none but a recent hand could have set it? Roland regarded it, his face carefully composed. "I cannot answer for tricks of joiners or idle boys," he said at last. "If you think I had a hand in such foolishness, you are gravely mistaken." Holmes tucked the fragment away as if the matter were concluded. "Perhaps," he said lightly, "we shall see when the remainder of the will is deciphered. Until then, we are all, I suppose, at the mercy of whispers." With that, he turned the conversation to indifferent matters, and after a few more strained courtesies, we withdrew. Once alone with me in the corridor, Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Observe, Watson, the man betrayed himself thrice. First, when I spoke of vinegar, his flush was not of ignorance but of memory. Second, when confronted with the thread, his answer was too polished, the phrasing of one who had rehearsed a denial. And third, you missed it. When I mentioned the deciphering of the will, he bit his lip as though calculation had slipped its leash. He fears what remains will suffice to establish Lady Eugenia's claim." "Then you believe him the culprit?" I asked. "I believe him to be involved," Holmes replied. "Yet involvement is not proof. A cunning brain may employ an eager accomplice. We must distinguish between hand and mind. Roland may have tampered, but who devised? That is the question." We spent the afternoon in quiet inquiries. Holmes examined the study safe, noting with satisfaction the scratches about the lock that bespoke an amateur hand rather than a professional cracksman. He questioned Ashcroft on Lord Adrian's affairs and learned that a dispute over Cornish mining shares had estranged uncle and nephew in recent months. He spoke also with Dr. Newberry, whose honest perplexity at the whole business convinced Holmes that he had no part save as a bystander. Evening fell with a soft drizzle. Holmes stood once more before the oak parlour door, his face set in thought. "Watson," he said, "the whisper has told us much, yet we require it to speak one word more. Tonight we repeat our vigil, only this time we shall not guard the room alone. I have arranged for Mr. Vale to be kept ignorant of our watch. If he or his agent comes again, we must be ready. For men who trust to phantoms often reveal themselves when they think the house asleep." He set his hand upon the latch, and in his eyes burned that light I had seen on many a case before, the light that precedes the net drawing tight. And so, as the rain whispered against the windows, and the night gathered about Ashwick House, we prepared ourselves to catch the voice behind the whisper and the hand behind the flame. The night drew its curtains close about Ashwick House, and the hush of rain on the windows seemed to deepen every creak of timber and rustle of fabric. Holmes and I returned to the oak parlour at the hour when the household had retired, the candle placed once more in its stand, the strings of our earlier experiment removed, lest they betray the trap we intended to set. Holmes settled himself against the wall nearest the study door, his lean form part of the shadow. I, at his instruction, occupied the chair by the bier, my revolver within reach, though he had assured me it was unlikely to be required. His last remark before the silence fell was a whisper that seemed to dissolve into the dark. When men play with whispers, Watson, they forget that silence listens harder. The minutes crawled. The candle guttered and straightened again, and the room grew close with the scent of wax and oak. Once or twice I thought I heard a shifting beyond the panel, as though the house itself flexed in its sleep. But Holmes did not stir, and I told myself it was only the imagination that thrives in long vigils. Then, near to 1 o'clock, came a faint scrape from the corridor, the delicate pressure of a shoe upon stone. Holmes's hand rose briefly in signal. The latch moved, and this time the door eased inward without resistance. Someone had managed the bolt with a slender tool. A shadow glided across the threshold, pausing to listen, then advanced toward the bier. The intruder bore a dark lantern, its shutter turned low, so that only a thin ribbon of light fell across the floorboards. His head was covered by a hood, but the carriage of his shoulders and the quick, almost jaunty step betrayed a certain youth. Holmes, silent as breath itself, slipped from his corner and was upon him in 2 strides. With a swift hand he tore the lantern free and snapped the shutter wide, flooding the room with sudden brilliance. The figure recoiled, raising an arm, and I saw at once the sharp features of Roland Vale. His eyes darted from me to Holmes and back again, and for an instant he seemed to calculate defiance. Then his lips twisted into a smile too brittle for composure. "My dear Mr. Holmes," he said with a false ease, "you startle me. I had not thought the parlour so jealously guarded. Holmes's voice was dry. When one revisits a crime, Mr. Vale, it is prudent not to choose the very room which has already betrayed you once. What errand brings you with lantern and lockpick to your late uncle's coffin chamber? Roland attempted a shrug. Sentiment, sir. The place troubled me, and I would see it once more alone. Holmes held the lantern so that its beam rested directly on the young man's coat. A fold gaped at the pocket, showing a coil of thin wire and a small vial. He plucked both out with a speed that brooked no resistance. Sentiment indeed. A horsehair thread, and here he uncorked the vial delicately. Our old companion, vinegar. You would efface the very traces you left us, foolish. The oak speaks louder than you imagine. Roland's face hardened. You have no proof, he said sharply. No witness but yourselves. No document entire. Nothing that could condemn me before a magistrate. Holmes regarded him with that quiet amusement which, I confess, chills me more than his anger ever could. Proof, Mr. Vale, is not a conjurer's trick. It is a mosaic. Each stone by itself may appear slight, but together they form a picture no eye can mistake. You left scratches upon the safe lock that only an unskilled hand could make. You bribed a servant to mask the scent of glue. You removed the clapper from a clock, lest it strike at an inconvenient hour. You over-whisper out of wood and air, hoping terror would serve where courage failed. And tonight, you return with the very implements that condemn you. Roland's gaze flicked toward the door, but Holmes forestalled the movement with a hand upon his arm, gentle yet absolute. I think not, he murmured. You will remain here until Lady Eugenia has joined us. She is entitled to hear the voice that plotted against her inheritance. At his summons, Ashcroft was sent to fetch her. She entered moments later, pale but resolute, her eyes fixed upon her nephew. Roland, she said, is it true? He did not answer. The silence spoke more clearly than words. Holmes inclined his head. Lady, it is not yet the full tale. Your nephew is bold but not inventive. He is the hand, not the mind. Another contrived the whisper. Another guided the theft. Ashcroft started visibly, his face paling. You cannot mean... Holmes's gaze rested upon him with terrible calm. Who else but the secretary knows every habit of the house, every corner of its study, every hour when a mistress keeps her vigil? Who but he could ensure the latch was left vulnerable, the room prepared? I smelled the ash upon your cuff, Mr. Ashcroft, the pumice at your hem. You handled the hearth when you should not. Roland Vale may have sought to profit, but it was you who fashioned the phantom that frightened Lady Eugenia into calling for aid. The secretary swayed as if struck. That is monstrous, he cried hoarsely. Holmes's hand rose. Spare us denial. You see, I have not accused you without reason. The panel conceals a recess built long after the house itself. Within it I found not only the will, but a tiny lantern still warm with the touch of your oil. The glue, the thread, the very calculation of the flame's fall. These are not the work of a heedless heir, but of one skilled in contrivance. Roland was to benefit, certainly, but who better than his uncle's secretary to engineer the means? Roland turned upon Ashcroft then with sudden fury. You told me it would be safe. You swore she would never suspect. The words tumbled out before he could recall them. Lady Eugenia drew herself up, her dignity unbroken, though her hand trembled upon the chair back. Holmes, satisfied, closed the lantern's shutter with a decisive snap. The whisper has spoken, he said. And it tells us that greed is a duet, not a solo. The room was silent save for the rain, which pattered faintly against the window, as if to applaud the revelation. Ashcroft stood motionless, his face drained of colour, his lips working soundlessly as though words had deserted him. Roland, flushed and panting, glared at him with the expression of a man who realizes too late the trap in which he has entangled himself. Lady Eugenia, though stricken, remained upright with that unyielding poise which seemed to belong to her lineage as much as to herself. Holmes allowed the silence to weigh upon them all, knowing that silence is often heavier than accusation. At last the secretary found his voice. It is not as you say, Mr. Holmes. I never contrived such devilry. I was but persuaded, drawn into a scheme I scarcely understood. Roland came to me, he pressed me, and lies. Roland burst out, his voice harsh. You brought the plan, you with your glib assurances. You showed me how the panel could be cut, how the flue might whisper. I never should have dared half of it had you not promised success. Ashcroft wheeled upon him with desperation. And who stood to gain? Not I. What portion of Lord Adrian's wealth falls to a secretary? You would have seen me cast aside with a gratuity, while you pocketed estates and shares. Do not paint me the architect when I was but the tool. Holmes raised a hand, and the storm of recrimination stilled as though under a spell. Gentlemen, he said, you weary yourselves in apportioning guilt when both of you are already entangled by your own confessions. But let us be precise. Mr. Ashcroft, you had the skill and the opportunity to fashion the whisper. Your very sleeve told me you handled Ash and Pumice. Mr. Vale, you supplied the motive most urgent, the fear of a new will disinheriting you. Each of you hoped to use the other, and together you constructed a phantom to frighten a lady and cover a theft. Roland dropped into a chair, his hands clutching his knees, and gave a low, bitter laugh. You cannot prove it before a court, Holmes. You speak cleverly, but words are not irons. Holmes regarded him with cool amusement. Courts have hanged men for less, but you are mistaken, Mr. Vale. I do not rest upon words alone. You brought with you tonight wire and vinegar, both stained with the glue used upon the panel. That vial bears your prints in glue and wax, and Mr. Ashcroft's blade, still in his pocket, matches the fresh scoring upon the panel's edge. The mosaic, as I said, is complete. Ashcroft flinched visibly. His hand strayed toward his coat, then fell away in despair. Lady Eugenia's voice, quiet but resolute, cut through the tension. What then, Mr. Holmes? Do I summon the constable and see them march through Dulverton as common criminals? That, lady, is your right, Holmes answered. Yet consider, public scandal, a family name dragged in the mire, the whisper of the panel repeated in every tavern. Justice may be satisfied by other means. The law delights in forms, but truth delights in exposure. She studied him gravely. And what would you advise? Holmes's gaze swept over the two men. Roland Vale must relinquish all claim under the older will and stand aside for Lady Eugenia as the rightful heir. Ashcroft must depart this house at once, stripped of every trust and comfort. If either seeks to contest, the evidence is ready for Scotland Yard. The choice is theirs. Roland's head sank. You would see me ruined, he muttered. You ruined yourself the moment you made Wood speak with lies, Holmes replied coldly. Better ruined in purse than ruined in soul. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Ashcroft, shoulders sagging, gave a hoarse whisper of his own. I will go. The country is wide, and perhaps somewhere I may still earn my bread. Roland looked at Lady Eugenia, but her gaze was fixed, unyielding. At last he dropped his eyes. I will not contest. Holmes inclined his head as though acknowledging the inevitable. Then we are agreed. Lady Eugenia, you have your inheritance secured without a magistrate's pen. The oak parlour will whisper no more. The candle guttered low, and Holmes extinguished it with a swift motion. The sudden dark seemed a relief, as though the house itself sighed at the release of its secret. We left the chamber together. Lady Eugenia, tall and proud, Ashcroft shuffling as if already burdened with exile, Roland silent, his youthful arrogance broken like a toy. In the hall, Holmes paused to replace his hat. You see, Watson, he said, the danger of whispers. They begin as trifles, meant to mislead, but soon they ensnare the very men who contrive them. Our task was merely to listen until the house itself told the truth. The following morning, arrangements were made swiftly. Ashcroft departed before dawn, a single bag in his hand, not daring a farewell. Roland lingered until noon, then rode away under his aunt's cool dismissal, his fortune diminished and his pride in tatters. The oak parlour stood silent, its panel restored, its candlesticks polished to an innocent gleam. The will, though charred, sufficed to establish Lady Eugenia's rights, and her gratitude to Holmes was expressed not in words alone, but in the serenity she recovered. As our train bore us back toward London, I looked upon my friend with the admiration that never diminished, though I had witnessed his genius countless times. You saw it all from the first, Holmes. Not all, he said with a faint smile. At first I thought only of the whisper, a curiosity of physics. But the thread betrayed contrivance, and contrivance betrayed intent. Once intent is established, Watson, the path is as plain as the line of rails before this train. He leaned back, eyes half closed, the faintest air of amusement about his lips. And yet, he added, there is a lesson in it. A whisper may unsettle the stoutest heart, but truth requires no voice at all. It stands silent and immovable, waiting for the ear that chooses to hear it. The countryside slid past in a wash of green and grey. Holmes said no more, and I, content to let silence hold us, reflected that for all the contrivances of men, there was still nothing more eloquent than the unspoken brilliance of Sherlock Holmes. The journey back to London was marked by one of Holmes's rare moods of repose. He smoked in silence for much of the way, the grey spirals of tobacco drifting lazily about his head as the countryside slipped by in a wash of mist and hedgerow. I could not help but reflect that the matter, though resolved without recourse to law, had borne within it a certain melancholy. A family fractured, a loyal servant exposed as traitor, a young man's pride broken, and all contrived beneath the venerable roof of Ashwick House. Justice had been served. Perhaps yet no one could claim triumph. Holmes seemed to sense my thoughts, for he roused himself suddenly and regarded me with that half-amused, half-piercing look he often wore when anticipating my reflections. "You are troubled, Watson. I confess I am, Holmes. The lady may have regained her inheritance, but it has cost her dearly in trust. She has lost both secretary and nephew in a single stroke. That is the nature of truth, my dear fellow," Holmes replied softly. "It seldom restores what was before, but it clears the ground for what may yet come. You must not measure our work in happiness gained, but in deception ended." I nodded, though uneasily, and we let the rhythm of the train carry us in quiet until the familiar haze of London smoke welcomed us back. Baker Street received us as it always did, with Mrs. Hudson's relief at seeing us intact and the reassuring warmth of the fire. I fancied the case concluded, and that Holmes would soon bury himself again in monographs or chemical experiments. Yet within 3 days the matter returned to us in a most unexpected form. It was mid-morning when Inspector Lestrade appeared at our rooms, his boots still damp from the fog outside, his sharp features betraying an excitement that would not be contained. "Holmes," he began at once, "I hear you've been meddling in Devon again. This business at Ashwick House, whispers in parlours, wills half-burnt, and heirs skulking about with lanterns. It's all over the yard, and I've come to ask—" "To ask or to crow?" Holmes interjected coolly. "The yard has little reason to boast when its theories would have seen an innocent lady branded hysterical." Lestrade waved the thrust aside with good humour. "Say what you will, but there's more afoot. Roland Vale turned up in Exeter yesterday, and before nightfall he was in a brawl at a gaming club. When the police intervened, they found on him certain papers that ought never to have left his uncle's safe. Holmes sat upright. "Papers, you say?" "Bank drafts, promissory notes, a bundle of correspondence concerning those mining shares you mentioned," Lestrade said. "For enough, they think, to cast suspicion not only on young Vale but on the secretary as well. And here's the rub. Ashcroft has not been seen since leaving the house. Vanished as clean as smoke." Holmes's fingers drummed the arm of his chair. "Curious. We permitted the matter to rest upon private settlement, but it seems the actors are unwilling to let the curtain fall. What say you, Watson? Shall we attend the second act?" Lestrade, who had learned by experience that Holmes's derision was no bar to collaboration, pressed eagerly for his aid. "It is a tidy knot, Holmes. Roland claims Ashcroft forced the papers upon him, that he sought only to safeguard them. Yet his story reeks. Ashcroft, meanwhile, is nowhere. If you've a mind to look into it, you'd save us weeks." Holmes rose and took his hat from its peg, with that suddenness which marked his decision. "Then we shall begin at Exeter, Lestrade. Bring the papers, if you please. A man who fabricates whispers in oak is capable of weaving more dangerous illusions." By that evening we were again on the move, the train carrying us southwest through gathering twilight. Lestrade, though fond of blunt pronouncements, knew enough to leave Holmes to his silence. I, however, could not. "Holmes," I said quietly, "you concluded the case in Devon with admirable clarity. What now persuades you to reopen it?" Holmes regarded the darkening window. "The pattern, Watson. Always the pattern. At Ashwick House, we discerned the shape of greed wrapped in contrivance, yet certain elements were left unresolved. The vinegar too liberally used, the servant's trembling fear, the haste with which the panel was cut. Such things suggest a mind not merely greedy but desperate. I begin to suspect Ashcroft's role was deeper than we imagined, and that Roland was less accomplice than instrument. And you think the missing secretary is at the heart of it still?" "I do," said Holmes. "When a man disappears without trace after exposure, he is not fleeing shame but pursuing profit. I fancy Ashcroft had in his keeping something far more valuable than a testament. If we discover what that was, We shall learn why whispers were made to follow Candlelight. We arrived at Exeter under a drizzling rain. Lestrade led us straight to the station where Roland Vale was held. The young man was pale, his charm worn to tatters, but when he saw Holmes, his eyes flared with a mixture of resentment and hope. "You must believe me, Holmes," he cried. "Ashcroft thrust those papers upon me. He said they were the key to recovering what I had lost. I swear I did not steal them from my uncle's safe." Holmes regarded him without pity. "And yet they were in your pocket, Mr. Vale. The Yard will not concern itself with whether you carried them for another." Roland slumped, defeated. "Then find Ashcroft," he muttered. "He is the spider, not I." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A spider, you say? An apt image. For even now, Watson, I sense the web is not yet fully spun, and we may find ourselves entangled if we do not tread carefully." The candle-lit whispers of Ashwick House had seemed strange enough, but as we stepped once more into the wet streets of Exeter, I knew with certainty that the true voice behind them had yet to be heard. The drizzle clung to Exeter's narrow lanes like a veil, softening the lamps into wavering halos and lending the old stone buildings a spectral aspect. Holmes moved through it with the air of a man whose purpose cut straight through weather and shadow alike. Lestrade, muttering about damp collars, trailed beside him while I kept pace, watching his profile for those small signs, the narrowing of the eyes, the sharper set of the lips that told me his mind was already constructing its lattice of deduction. Our first errand was to examine the bundle of papers seized from Roland Vale. Lestrade produced them in the sitting-room of our inn, spreading them upon the table under the glow of an oil lamp. Holmes bent over them, his long fingers moving delicately across the scorched edges and ink-stained leaves. They were, as Lestrade had said, drafts and promissory notes, transactions concerning Lord Adrian's ventures in Cornwall. Yet among them Holmes discovered something else, a letter half consumed by fire, its upper corner blackened, but the body legible enough to read. It was written in a neat but anonymous hand, dated a fortnight before Lord Adrian's death, and it spoke in guarded terms of securing the venture and silencing opposition. More curiously, it instructed that certain shares be transferred at once to an unnamed party in London. Holmes's face sharpened as he read it. "Here, Watson, is the true ghost behind our whisper. The testament was but a veil. The real struggle lay in these mining shares. Someone sought to control them, and Lord Adrian's death provided the opportunity." "But the hand?" I asked. Holmes tapped the letter with a finger. "The formation of the capitals is meticulous, almost schoolmasterly, but there is the faintest tremor in the downstrokes. Not the hand of a young man. Ashcroft perhaps, or another mind yet unseen. The key is the phrase silencing opposition. Lord Adrian had quarrelled with his nephew, but a nephew is not opposition in a financial venture. That word belongs to the language of commerce and control." Lestrade, restless, demanded what this meant for his case. Holmes only smiled faintly. "It means, my dear Inspector, that you are chasing a hare when a fox runs before you. Roland Vale may have played the fool, but the cunning lies elsewhere." The following morning Holmes made inquiries at the local registry. He discovered that in the days before Lord Adrian's illness, Ashcroft had withdrawn a set of documents relating to the very shares in question. He signed under his own name, though it was unusual for a secretary to be entrusted with such matters. When Holmes pressed further, the clerk recalled Ashcroft leaving in the company of a tall man with a beard streaked with grey, a stranger not known in Exeter. That night, back at our inn, Holmes paced the floor with an energy that would not allow him rest. "Consider it, Watson. Ashcroft disappears at the very moment Roland is disgraced. He leaves behind not only the fragments of the will, but papers which tie Roland fatally to the safe. Meanwhile he departs with a confederate, and the true prize, the shares, remains unaccounted for. Ashcroft has used Roland as a decoy, letting him draw all suspicion while he himself secures the spoils." "And where does he flee?" I asked. "To London, almost certainly. The letter spoke of a party there, and only in London can such shares be transferred without scrutiny. Our task is to overtake him before the trail grows cold." Lestrade agreed readily, though he grumbled at the prospect of more travel. By the next day we were bound northward again, the rain giving way to a brittle sunlight that did little to warm the chill of pursuit. Holmes spent the journey in calculations, scribbling notes and cross-referencing times of trains, with the dates of Ashcroft's movements. By the time we reached the capital, his plan was formed. We went at once to the offices of the brokerage firm where Lord Adrian's affairs had been conducted. Holmes, with his peculiar mixture of bluntness and charm, persuaded the chief clerk to show us the recent transfers. Sure enough, 2 days before, a large block of shares had been signed over in the name of Lionel Ashcroft, acting under special authorization. The receiving party was listed as one Mr. Gregory Fenton, of Threadneedle Street. Holmes's eyes glittered. Fenton, the very man Lord Adrian had opposed in the matter of the mines. He is known for ruthless speculation. Now we see the shape entire, Ashcroft and Fenton together, weaving a scheme to strip Lady Eugenia and her husband's line of control. The whisper in the oak parlour was but the curtain behind which this greater theft played. Lestrade slapped the ledger shut. Then we've but to arrest them both. Holmes shook his head. Not so simple. Fenton is powerful, his dealings vast and his respectability a fortress. Ashcroft will be his disposable instrument, but Fenton will see to it that no charge touches him. We must catch them in act with evidence beyond all artifice. That evening, Holmes led us through the narrow streets of the city, his step quick and sure. At last we reached a warehouse by the river, shuttered and silent save for the creak of barges below. From a shadowed arch we observed 2 figures within, Ashcroft, thinner and more harried than when last we saw him, and a tall bearded man, whose commanding presence left no doubt he was Gregory Fenton. They bent over a table strewn with papers, speaking in low voices. Holmes touched my arm. The web, Watson, is nearly spun, but a spider is never more dangerous than when he thinks his web secure. Tonight we must pluck a single thread, and the whole will tremble. His eyes gleamed in the gloom, and I knew the chase was nearing its climax. The whisper that had begun in oak and candlelight was now a roar that reached the heart of London finance, and before the night was done, it would either expose the truth entire or ensnare us all in its silken threads. The Thames lay dark beneath the warehouse windows, its sluggish tide carrying the faint odour of tar and refuse, and the night air was heavy with damp mist. Holmes crouched beside me in the shadow of the arch, his sharp profile etched against the faint glow seeping from the cracks in the shutters. Within, Ashcroft bent over the table, his shoulders hunched like a man shrinking from the very conspiracy he served, while Fenton stood straight and commanding, a predator whose confidence filled the room as palpably as the smoke of his cigar. The papers spread before them rustled faintly in the draught, and I could just catch the clink of coins being counted into a leather pouch. Holmes's eyes glinted in the dim light. "Patience, Watson," he breathed. "Men like Fenton hang themselves if given rope enough." We watched in tense silence as Fenton pushed a sheet across the table. "Sign it," he said in a voice that carried through the boards, firm and resonant. "Your usefulness is ending, Ashcroft, but you shall have your reward if you do not falter now. Transfer the remainder of the shares and the affair is concluded." Ashcroft's hand trembled as he took up the pen. For a moment he seemed paralyzed. Then he muttered something inaudible. Fenton's fist struck the table with such force the lamp jumped. "No hesitation. Do you imagine your lady employer suspects you yet? Do you think that conjurer Holmes can reach you here?" At that Holmes shifted, as though the words were a summons. His fingers tightened on my sleeve, and I saw he was waiting for one precise instant. The pen touched paper. Ashcroft scrawled his name in a faltering hand. Fenton snatched the sheet, scanned it, and gave a curt nod. "It is done. By tomorrow Ashwick's legacy is dust." That was enough. Holmes rose from his crouch with sudden energy and strode into the lamplight, his long shadow flung across the table. "That, Mr. Fenton, is where you err. Ashwick's legacy is not dust, but fire, and you have just lit it yourself." Ashcroft sprang back with a cry. Fenton wheeled round, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Holmes, myself behind him, and Lestrade close at hand, revolver drawn. For a moment the air seemed to crackle with the violence of Fenton's will, and I feared he might rush us like a cornered beast. But he only smiled, a hard, thin smile. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said slowly, "the whispering phantom of Devonshire was your work then." Holmes's gaze was unflinching. "My work was only to hear it, and to discover whose breath made it speak. Yours, Mr. Fenton. You directed Ashcroft, used Roland as your decoy, and contrived to seize what law would not give you. But law has a long arm, and tonight it closes round you." Lestrade stepped forward briskly. "Gregory Fenton, I arrest you in the name of the law for fraud, conspiracy, and theft." The bearded man gave a short laugh, almost of admiration. "And what evidence will you wave before a magistrate, Inspector?" "Words, suspicions." Holmes held up the fresh sheet still wet with Ashcroft's signature. "Evidence enough," he said quietly. "You compelled a man to sign away shares under duress in this very room before witnesses. And the earlier letter," Holmes tapped his breast pocket, "speaks of silencing opposition. That, joined to Ashcroft's testimony, will suffice." Ashcroft, pale and shaking, sank into a chair. His voice came in a rush, broken but unmistakable. "It is true, he promised me freedom, money, a new life. He devised the whisper, the contrivance in the oak parlor. Only I cut the panel at his bidding. He wished to destroy the will and seize the shares. I was his instrument, nothing more." Fenton's face hardened. "Fool," he hissed, but the contempt was for the secretary, not for Holmes. He saw the game lost, though his composure never faltered. "Very well, gentlemen. The web breaks, but remember, every spider has spun another before this one is swept away." Holmes's eyes gleamed at the remark, but he only motioned Lestrade to do his duty. The inspector clapped irons upon Fenton, and 2 constables, summoned earlier by Holmes's foresight, stepped in from the shadows to secure him. Ashcroft, left free for the moment, collapsed into silent misery, his head buried in his hands. Later, as we emerged from the warehouse into the misty street, Holmes drew a long breath of the night air, as though cleansing himself of the miasma within. "The case, Watson," he said, "was never about whispers alone. They were but the toy of a greater deceit. Fenton is a man who cloaks greed in contrivance, using others as puppets. Ashcroft lacked strength to resist. Roland lacked sense to perceive, and Lady Eugenia lacked protection until we arrived. And now?" I asked. "Now the courts will decide their fate. Yet mark me, Watson, Fenton is cunning, and men of his stripe do not easily fall. The law must be vigilant, lest whispers of influence reach higher than oak paneling." We walked in silence toward the river, the fog swirling round the lamps, until Lestrade broke it with uncharacteristic warmth. "Holmes, I'll give you this. When you pluck a thread, the whole web comes tumbling down." Holmes inclined his head with dry amusement. "Only if one knows which thread to pluck, Inspector. The rest is patience, and the willingness to listen when oak itself seems to speak." The river lapped softly against its moorings, as if echoing his words. And I could not shake the thought that the whisper begun in a lonely Devonshire parlour had now grown into a voice loud enough to bring down a man of London's highest speculations. Yet beside me, Holmes's stride was light, almost careless, as though the mystery had already been folded, sealed and placed in the cabinet of his mind, ready to be forgotten until the next summons called us once more into the fog. The following morning, London shook off its mist with reluctant indolence, the streets wet with last night's rain, and the air pungent with coal smoke. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in Lestrade's company, Fenton lodged securely under guard, and Ashcroft delivered into custody with the promise of leniency should he bear witness. Yet even as Mrs. Hudson set a fresh pot of coffee before us, I knew from Holmes's restless pacing that the matter was not, in his estimation, concluded. He halted suddenly by the window, his gaze fixed upon the street below, where the bustle of cabs and porters resumed their eternal dance. "There is a discord, Watson. The melody of a case ought to resolve into its natural cadence. But here we hear an unfinished note." "Surely, Holmes," I protested. "With Fenton arrested and Ashcroft prepared to testify, Lady Eugenia's position is safe. The will survives, the shares are exposed, and Roland Vale, though disgraced, can no longer threaten her. What discord remains?" Holmes turned sharply. "You forget the letter. Silencing opposition." That phrase did not speak only of Lord Adrian. I have asked myself, what opposition could Fenton dread beyond the late lord? And why should Ashcroft, a mere secretary, be entrusted with matters weighty enough to alter the balance of a mining empire? No, Watson, there is another hand behind Fenton's, one which we have not yet seen. As if summoned by the thought, a rap sounded upon the door, brisk and imperious. A clerk entered, breathless from haste, bearing a sealed note. Holmes slit it open with his long finger and read in silence, his eyes narrowing. He tossed it across to me. The handwriting was different from Fenton's and Ashcroft's alike, smooth, commanding, without tremor. It read, "Mr. Holmes, you trespass upon interest too great for your meddling. Fenton is but a leaf in a storm. Should you persist, the wind will find you. Withdraw, or you shall hear whispers not in oak, but in your own blood." The clerk explained it had been delivered by an unknown messenger who vanished at once into the crowd. Holmes gave a short, mirthless laugh. "They grow bold, Watson. When threats arrive at Baker Street, it is a sign the quarry fears pursuit." Lestrade, who had lingered to share our breakfast, scowled as he read it. "I've had my fill of riddles, Holmes. Give me a name and I'll clap irons on him too. Patience, Inspector," Holmes replied, lighting his pipe. "Names must be earned by threads of evidence, not plucked from the air. This letter tells us that Fenton was not master but servant. And servants, however arrogant, point the way to their masters. That very afternoon, Holmes carried me through the labyrinth of the city, moving from one brokerage to another, examining registers and whispering questions to clerks who seemed astonished at his knowledge of their ledgers. At last, in an office off Cornhill, he paused before an entry. His eyes gleamed. "Observe, Watson. A vast transfer of funds, £200,000, made not to Fenton but through him, to a trust controlled by Sir Alaric Mortlake." The name struck no chord with me, but Holmes explained in a low tone as we emerged into the throng. "Mortlake is a financier of immense reach, seldom seen, but his fingers extend into every speculation of the city. He shuns publicity, preferring to act through agents, men like Fenton. If whispers were contrived at Ashwick House, they were to serve Mortlake's appetite for power. The discovery lent new urgency to the case. That evening we called again on Lestrade, who was already preparing his reports. He frowned when Holmes spoke the name. "Mortlake, eh? A man above reproach, or so they say." "Wealth can buy many things, Holmes, including silence." "Wealth cannot buy the truth," Holmes replied coldly, "and truth once found requires only a voice to carry it. Lady Eugenia must know whom she truly faced." The next day we journeyed once more to Ashwick House. The journey southward was under brighter skies than our first, and the field seemed almost to mock the darkness of the affair. Lady Eugenia received us in the same morning room, her composure as steady as ever, though her eyes softened when Holmes laid before her the tale entire: Ashcroft's treachery, Fenton's scheme, and behind them the shadow of Mortlake. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then my husband's death, was it natural or contrived?" Holmes answered with care. "The fever was genuine, lady, yet its convenience was seized upon. The whispers, the theft, the fire, they followed upon his death, not before. The vulture waits for nature, but it does not scruple to pluck the spoils." She closed her eyes briefly, then looked up with renewed resolve. "Then let the law pursue Mortlake if it can. I have lost enough to whispers." On our return to London that night, Holmes seemed less at ease. He spoke little, his gaze distant, until at last he murmured, "The opposition is silenced, perhaps, but who will silence the wind itself, Watson? Mortlake is not yet within our grasp. His name hovers like smoke, intangible, untouchable. This affair is not done. It has only lifted a veil upon a greater stage." I could not answer, for I too felt the weight of an unseen hand still at work. The whisper that had begun with a candle in an oak chamber had grown into a storm whose voice we had only begun to hear. Holmes sat beside me in the dim carriage, the faint glow of his pipe the only light upon his face, and I knew that until the shadow of Mortlake was pierced, he would not rest. The final weeks of that winter passed in a strange quiet, though in Holmes's mind the case had never ceased to whisper. Sir Alaric Mortlake remained an untouchable name in the city, his reputation unblemished, while Fenton languished in custody and Ashcroft prepared to turn King's evidence. Yet Holmes knew, as only he could, that the true architect had not yet been drawn into the light. It was not until a discreet letter arrived, penned by Lady Eugenia herself, that the matter at last resolved. She wrote of receiving, through channels she would not name, a sealed packet of papers, Lord Adrian's original correspondences with Mortlake, preserved by him in some hidden drawer Ashcroft had failed to breach. In them, Lord Adrian had documented every meeting, every threat, every scheme of Mortlake's design. He had known the financier's ambitions and resisted them to the last. His sudden illness may have been natural, but his foresight ensured his adversary could never wholly triumph. Holmes and I sat together by the fire as he examined the packet, the final pieces fitting into his design. "You see, Watson, Lord Adrian was no fool. He feared Mortlake's encroachment, and laid his defense not in lawyers or locks, but in the quiet strength of words committed to paper. Those papers arriving now complete the mosaic. Fenton's arrest, Ashcroft's confession, and Mortlake's own letters condemn him more surely than any whisper in oak. And what became of Sir Alaric? I asked. Holmes smiled thinly. Men like Mortlake do not fall in a day, but the machinery of law grinds slowly and relentlessly when once it has proof in its gears. By summer, his name will no longer stand among the untouchables of Threadneedle Street. There was silence for a time, broken only by the crackle of the fire. At last Holmes spoke again, his tone more reflective than triumphant. You recall, Watson, the first account Ashcroft gave, a whisper that follows the candlelight. It was the perfect image, for so often men are guided by whispers, greed, fear, ambition. They follow blindly, never perceiving the hand that placed the flame. Yet truth is not a whisper. It is a voice that endures, whether in oak or paper or conscience. Lady Eugenia's estate was secured, her dignity preserved, and her gratitude expressed with a grace that did her lineage honor. Roland Vale, chastened by his brush with ruin, withdrew from society for a time, and whether he would learn wisdom from folly was beyond even Holmes's calculation. Ashcroft, broken by shame, accepted his exile quietly, while Fenton's fate was sealed by the courts. Mortlake, the true spider, was at last dragged into the daylight, his webs torn apart by the very evidence he thought destroyed, and so the case that began with a strange murmur in a Devonshire parlour concluded with the exposure of a financier whose shadow had reached across counties. I closed my notebook one evening as Holmes lit his pipe, the satisfaction of a man who has heard the last note of a symphony resting faintly on his features. Another whisper silenced. Holmes, I remarked. He gave a dry chuckle. Silenced, Watson? No, whispers never cease, they only change their tongue. Our task is not to still them, but to hear them rightly, until they betray themselves. He leaned back then, the smoke rising about him like a curtain, and with that the case of the whisper that followed the candlelight passed into memory, another testament to the brilliance of Sherlock Holmes and to the quiet privilege I held in bearing witness to it.